everyone. I was asked to look at the Norfolk School Survey document of 1903, a document I didn't know anything about at all. And this document is available in the room next door for those of you in the room if you would like to look at it afterwards. The survey was carried out in 1903, and having been a teacher and then a head teacher all my working life in Norfolk, I was really fascinated to explore this document. And this wonderful photo that you see in front of you shows my grandmother in the middle, very carefully marked out with the blue biro by her, every archivist's nightmare, a biro, but at least I can recognise her. And my Auntie Mabel is in that photo somewhere too, but unfortunately, I don't know where. They attended Besthorpe School, a Norfolk school, very close to Attleborough. Now, we've all got experience of school. So some of you sitting here might have worked in the education sector. Some of you might have worked for the local education authority. And let's face it, we all went to school. So we all have some experience of the school system. So let's get started. This isn't a history of education. We would be here a very long time if it was, but it's just a snapshot of a significant moment in its history in the county schools of Norfolk. I'll aim to give you a brief background first, though, of the context of the survey. Now, elementary education, primary education, was pretty much a mixed bag until 1902. It was largely run by religious institutions, such as the first three that we can see here. So they obviously had a very strong emphasis on religious education. We have the national schools formed by the Anglican National Society. We have the British schools formed by the Society for Promoting the Lancastrian System of the Poor. We have Sunday schools run by local churches, ragged schools started by a gentleman called John Pounds, dame schools. We see a photo here of a dame school. They were small privately run schools for young children. And then we have board schools, and they came around in the 1870s, and they were managed by school boards. They did charge fees, but the poor were exempt. They did later, the board schools, become free with the Elementary Act of 1891. By the time of the survey of 1903, the leaving age was 12, and it had risen in stages from 1880, when the leaving age had been 10. So, 1902, the Balfour Education Act, it created local education authorities, and it brought together all the different provisions. While it weakened the divide between the board schools and the church schools, it did mean that church schools now received some funding from the state. It also led to the rapid growth of secondary schools. Now, this survey only looks at the county elementary schools under the management of Norfolk County Council. 4 LEAs were created in Norfolk, 1 for Great Yarmouth, 1 for King's Lynn, 1 for Norwich, and the county schools. This is the county survey. So why a survey? Well, for the newly established local education authorities, they needed to know, obviously, just what they were taking on. So they sent a survey out to all the schools now under the control of Norfolk County Council. In reality, it was an audit of provision, building, staffing, and other resources. For the head teacher, it was an opportunity, where necessary, to improve the overall provision of their school. Many had seen no improvements since they had been set up as board schools some 30 years previously. Now, the forms, which if you take a look later, if you're here in the room, are mainly in alphabetical order, but not always, as we see here at Matlask. Sorry. Because Matlask is listed under B, because Matlask came under Barningham Urban District. So if you can't find a school, it's likely to be somewhere else in the book. So we'll start with a quick whisk through the form, and then we'll go back to look at each section in more detail. Now, this is a lovely photograph of East Tuddenham and Honingham School, listed under T for Tuddenham. We can see Headmaster William Wright. standing very proudly with his pupils, while the 5 female members of staff are safely tucked behind the gates. So we will look at their form. The form had 6 sections. Now, don't worry if you can't see each section in turn. We will take a look at them in detail later. So section 1, we have the name of the school and the head teacher. Section 2 is the number of pupils on roll and the grant the school was entitled to. Section 3 was the staffing for each class. And note, throughout the form, anything usually written in red has been overwritten by the LEA. They're not the school's comments. It's quite significant later. Section 4 is about curriculum organisation. Section 5 is a plan of the school. And section 6 is school furniture. So that is how the form appears. So let's look at the slide. Head teachers were asked to submit a survey for each department, but not for any infant class. So most schools, the majority, submitted one form stating they were mixed. It was a mixed school. But there were others, such as Aylsham, that submitted 3 forms. One for the boys department, one for the girls, and one for the infants. Now, there is a subtle difference between an infant class and an infant department. The number of forms returned are linked to the number of departments as recognised by the boards that were set up in the 1870s. So while there are 493 survey forms in the book, there would have been a smaller number of actual schools. So the first part of the form, fairly straightforward. It named the school, it named the head teacher. It had to be completed on September the 30th, 1903, not too different to a school census today that has to be completed at a very specific time. Here we have William John Wright at East Tuddenham and Honingham, and he has stated that his department is mixed. By contrast, here are the beginnings of Aylsham's forms. And I repeat, the red underlining that you can see under infants is the work of the LEA. So Aylsham has 3 returns, but you will see in the survey returns book, they are all numbered as school 17. We have Thomas Hill, head of the boys department, his wife, Mary Hill, head of the girls, and a lady called Emily Dester, head of the infants. The second section of the form recorded the number of pupils, attendance numbers, not percentages, and the amount of grant paid over the last 3 years. The funding system was introduced by a gentleman called Robert Lowe in 1862, and it was largely payment by results. It was known as Lowe's Code. Lowe commented at the time that he couldn't promise his system would work, but he said, if it's not cheap, it will be efficient. If it's not efficient, it will be cheap. Grants were determined by 3 factors: attendance, staffing, and standards achieved. Under Article 101, it was 22 shillings per head. We can see all the different articles down the side. Some are not known at this current time. There were so many different articles brought out. Under Article 98, it was 17 shillings a head, but not if the average attendance for infants was under 20. So we can see here that at Itteringham, it received nothing under this criteria. Criteria for grants under Articles 105 and 104 are unclear, but they are linked to staffing. The registers were checked and inspectors tested the children in the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which begins with an A, I'd like to point out. Such pressure led teachers obviously to focus on rote learning to achieve the standards. And it was a stultifying system, as we can see by this inspector's comments at the bottom. That deadly system devised for the express purpose of strangling growth. This is Great Melton School, and we can see standing on the right near the door is Headmistress Bessie Wigg. These are her figures for section 2. You can see here the school did not have sufficient staff, at the bottom line, to qualify for the section 104 and 105 grant. If you look at the third line down, where the top arrow is pointing, the school did qualify for a 16 shilling grant in 1903 under Article 98, because Bessie's infant numbers had hit that 20 attendance target. So how crucial that was. Before we move on to the staffing section, there's another document which was called the salary returns form, and that was completed earlier that year, but it ties in very nicely with the school survey form. So earlier that year, they had asked schools to complete these forms. And this is the form for Matt Lask, known as Barningham. We have headmaster Thomas Henry Wood, top line of the staffing list. His wife and teacher Lily Ethel Wood, whose salary is nil, because obviously it's included in her husband's salary, and teacher Ada Agnes Philpotts. The staff are paid monthly. Mr. and Mrs. Wood have a rent-free house and they get free kindling. This was a husband and wife team, common in lots of schools. The teacher's marriage bar that some of us are aware of was not introduced until 1932. We can see, fourth column along, that they joined the school in January 1900, while Ada came along 2 years later. Note the salary increases and the red comments of the LEA commenting on why these salaries have increased so much. So let's see how this salary form matches up with the staffing section of their survey form. This section detailed the staffing, the qualifications, and who taught where. Thomas Wood was determined to plead his case and wrote at the top of this section, which is at the bottom of my slide, the school was officially warned April 1999 before he joined it in 1900. The official report said the staff should be both larger and better qualified, and the LEA had crossed his comments out. So let's look at the form left to right. So starting on the left, we have 3 classes. In yellow, we have the infants class. Then we have in blue, the junior class. And then we have the seniors. There is the infants class, totally separate. And then we have standards 1 to 7. Movement was by progress, not by age, but roughly 1 to 7 related to ages 7 through to 12. In the next column, we have the numbers in each class. So we can see in standard 7 at the top, there are no children in standard 7 at that particular time. We've got 3 in standard 6. And if we move to the bottom, we'll notice that Miss Philpotts has 53 children in her class. She has the biggest class of all. Then we come to the names of the staff. So we've got Thomas Henry Wood, we've got Lily, his wife, and we've got Ada Philpotts. And it's quite difficult to see, but the LEA has written in red that Ada is about to leave on the 29th of February in 1904. So they have crossed her out and put in other abbreviations to do with pupil teachers coming in. The next column along are the qualifications. We have 2 columns for certificated, fully qualified teachers. And that was either through college or training in school. So we can see that Thomas Wood was not college trained, but he was non-college trained. Many heads who were college trained had trained at St. Mark's in Chelsea, but not Henry. Then we have other articles of qualification. And despite all the research and all the help from the Archive Centre, we have been unable to unravel some of these articles. As I say, the rules kept changing. But an Article 68 teacher only had to be female, over 18 and vaccinated. So lots of you in this room will probably qualify And the headmaster's wife often fell into that category, but not Lily here. She had qualified in her own right. PT, next columns along, pupil teacher. Then we have probationers, and then finally we have monitors. Lots of schools have monitors to assist, what we might call teaching assistants today. The penultimate column is the salary of each member of staff. So don't forget, Mrs. Wood's salary is included in her husband's. And the final column are the years that they've been at the school, which should match up with the salary return form that we've just taken a look at. Now, that is quite useful if you're looking at census records, electoral records, trying to trace a family or people who have moved about. I'm going to stay at MATLAS for a little while because, like all these forms, there's a story behind the people who were there. And Thomas Wood was quite a character. Here he is with his wife, Lily. He taught at Rackheath before coming to MATLAS. His first wife died in 1895 and he married his school teacher a few months later. That was Lily. She had been the assistant schoolmistress at Rackheath. This is the first page of the logbook written by Thomas on his arrival at MATLAS in January 1900. He was not very happy. This time, the red that you can see are Henry's comments and not the LEA's, marking out the serious deficiencies he found in his school. And most of his logbook pages for this period are like this and make a very interesting read. Can find no code or instructions, no class records whatsoever, lack of apparatus, turn the desk to face the window in order to combat the deep shadows. And so he goes on and on about his school. So let's remind ourselves what Thomas wrote on his survey form about staffing. He wanted, obviously, better and more staff so that his pupils could progress to the next standard. As a headmaster, he had to account for progress or lack of, just like heads have to do today, as we can see from an extract here, later than 1903, where standards still seem to be an issue. I just find the vocabulary quite interesting. Idle rascality, notoriously dull, mental inability, doubtful sanity, young and idle, mental inability, in brackets grandparents, often ill, dropsy, ancestral dullness, and low environment effects of. He certainly did not mince his words. Let's go back to Aylsham. Now, Aylsham School, like MATLAS, was also quite a large family affair. The Hill family had moved from Shelley, near Huddersfield, 31 years previously, and Thomas was a very experienced headmaster. He had trained at St. Mark's at Chelsea. His son, Claude, highlighted there in orange, was in his second year of teaching, and his son, Frank, was also a very experienced teacher, marked there in blue, and he was a fellow of the Royal College of Organists. So let's match up the boys' department for Aylsham with their salary reform. So we can see Thomas gets a rent-free house. He's the headmaster. Claude and Frank are living at home, so they're in the house too. Thomas also earned £2 as secretary of the Providence Society. So this form asked if members of staff worked elsewhere, and son Frank earned £25 as the local church organist. Now here we have his wife, Mary Ann Hill, head of the girls' department, also college trained. We can see the LEA comment that Elsie Gosling is not wanted. They have written that by her name. Article 68 at the bottom is not wanted. Now, we don't know if that was Mary Hill not wanting poor Elsie, or the LEA decided that Elsie wasn't wanted. All the family are together in the schoolhouse. And the 1911 census records show Thomas and Mary Ann Hill as having had 11 children, 5 of whom had died. I've only been able to find 10 of them, but most of their children went into teaching. Their son, Geoffrey, became headmaster of the boys' school at Aylsham when Thomas unwillingly had to retire at the age of 65, which was the statutory retirement age. Here we can see Herbert Plough with his wife, Phoebe, and Herbert was the headmaster and the teacher at Itteringham and Mannington. They had previously taught at Corston since 1886, and they came to Itteringham in 1897. They had no children. So let's look at their salary return form. Herbert, like Thomas Hill at Aylsham, had trained at St Mark's, Chelsea. Phoebe was an Article 68 teacher. Phoebe's salary was merged with Herbert's. Herbert had signed up for the new superannuation scheme, and not all heads did, and that is shown on the salary reforms. They lived rent-free in their schoolhouse with 1.5 tons of coal. The last record I could find for the couple being in Itteringham is in 1909, when presumably Herbert retired, although at that point he was only in his late 50s. Trying to follow them through, I was quite shocked to find them both in the Balfour workhouse in 1911. Were they victims of tied accommodation? Did he not realise that by leaving, his successor would want the schoolhouse they'd been living in? When Thomas Hill at Aylsham had retired, he and his wife Mary continued to live in the schoolhouse, and their son Geoffrey, who took over the headship, continued to happily live elsewhere in Aylsham. So we can see here their return form. Phoebe died in 1913 in Norwich, and I just hope it wasn't in the workhouse. However, Herbert moved in with his sister in Norwich, who was also a retired teacher, and she died in 1925. The relationship between the head teacher and the LEA was complex. Heads had new employers. Many schools had had no investment since the 1870s. Both the LEA and the heads had to manage a budget, as today, and the LEA was sometimes dismissive of the needs of the school, and perhaps the schools were equally not understanding the scale of what these new LEAs had to take on. So the staffing part of the form did give the heads opportunity to raise their concerns. The staffing, here we have Thomas Wood again at Atlask and Upwell St Peter. We can see our present staff is incomplete. I am waiting a visit from HMI to discuss this question, etc., etc. And the LEA had written across no such thing. Equally, Spall with Palgrave. The school has been badly staffed for some years, and the master would be glad if the county council would quite kindly consider the question. The next part of the form is about curriculum organisation, and it asks about occasional teachers and the grouping for teaching different parts of the curriculum. Needlework was often taught by the headmaster's wife, as we have here at Bunwell. Her salary, again, included in her husband's. We also see here we have Daniel Baker coming in to teach the boys drill at 4 shillings a week. The section also refers to curriculum grouping, singing for everybody, object lessons on common things, usually but always taught to the younger classes, while the older juniors had the more traditional separation of subjects such as history, geography, etc. If you explore any school logbook, you will often see the object lessons to be taught for that term. So here we have an example of an object lesson, a commercially produced lesson. It's very prescriptive. It's a lesson to be learnt, not necessarily understood. So you take a specimen of black lead, cedar wood is prepared, lead let into the groove, top and bottom pieces glued together, ready to cut. top and bottom rounded on one side, top and bottom partly rounded on both sides, ready for sandpapering, completed cedar pencil, coloured and gilded. You all now know how a pencil is made. Here we have an excerpt from the school logbook of Tatterford with Tatterset and the list of objects for the coming term. We have natural history of the sheep, the goat. We have objects, parts of a plant, orange, paper, wood, wool. Conversational, what a dog can do. And I really like the final one, things seen in the school playground, because as a head teacher, that brings back lots of memories for me. I just want to go back to that slide because I did have 2 slides for this ladies' object lessons, but the second one, some of the items listed in it would be really offensive to us today from a politically correct point of view. So that's not included. The next part of the survey allowed headmasters to exhibit their drawing skills that they'd had taught to them when they were at school. It takes us on to the plan. The LEA understandably needed to know their property portfolio that they were inheriting, so they asked head teachers to draw a plan of their school. But why bother drawing a plan when there was only one room, as here at Riddlesworth near Diss? It was another good opportunity for heads to plead their case for better accommodation. There may not be a plan here, but note the precision of measuring 24 feet and 1 inch, 1 room. And note also her specific details in terms of measuring the very little that she has. Now, William Wallace at Corpusty, he could really go to town with drawing his plan because he had 2 rooms. So here we have a very elaborate plan showing large room for standards 1 to 7 and a very small room for the infants, which took 55 children. So quite a contrast to the first image that we saw. And again, contrast again, Holm next Runton, Headmaster William Baker, and the great detail, which will be impossible to see because it is so detailed, of all the rooms and the windows and the desks. And here the red is his own. So an even greater contrast to the previous 2 images. Now at St Michael's at Aylsham, as I said before, we had 3 survey returns. So obviously we had 3 plans. So this is Aylsham Boys, set out quite straightforward. Here we have the girls' department next door. The numbers show the accommodation. And then note here at the top, there is a door coming out of the back of the girls' department into the infant school, which has actually been crossed off by the LEA, but that door does exist. And then we have the infants department. And note the gallery seating. Infants were often seated on a gallery system, which is quite strange really when you consider how unsafe it would have been. And I remember somebody visiting my school who'd been at the school many, many years before and remembered the gallery seating. And his story was that in the winter time, you pretended to be really stupid because you could sit right at the bottom near the fire. And then you got cleverer and cleverer as the year went on. So by the summer, you were right up at the top where all the windows were open and it was lovely and fresh. And again, here we've got the door into the girls' school. So let's try and put the 3 together, obviously not to scale, but we have the boys' department on the left, the girls on the right, and forming that L shape, the infants with the door going into the back of the girls' room. And that's Aylsham School as it was then. And you can see the fence in the photo, keeping the 2 junior schools separate, the girls from the boys in the playground. The final section asked about furniture. So we've gone back to Tatterford with Tatterset, where Ida Pike was headmistress. And here we can see she's made a very thorough inventory of her school. And if you notice what she's written, third line down, highlighted in orange, before the appointed day, before the handover to the local education authority. And at the bottom, it has been signed off by her board manager, the Reverend Ralph Jones, in 1903. But very specific: 2 fire guards, 1 coal scuttle, apparatus, 3 maps, 3 blackboards, etc., etc. She has itemised everything in her school. Now, for many schools, they'd had no new furniture since the 1870s when the board schools were set up. So this section, this final section, gave the heads a final opportunity to make a plea for their schools. And they asked about the furniture, how many children could be seated, the quantity and quality of the desks, the type of desk, did it have a gallery for the infants, how many cupboards, did it have a museum, come back to that, blackboards and easel, the master's desk. So those were the things they were asked about in the final section to do with furniture. So let's look at each one in turn. What you can do is you can match up the accommodation question with the numbers on the plans that they've given, and also the staffing section. So you have pupil numbers on different parts of the form. So the accommodation question will allow you to see whether there were any overcrowding issues when you compare them to the numbers on roll. Itteringham stated it had room for 60 children, but only had 54 children on roll. So we had no overcrowding issues at Itteringham. It's an interesting figure in terms of studying changing demographics in a town or in a village. So the only figure here, which I've typed in red, is Aylsham Infants, which has accommodation for 65 children, but actually has 119 on roll. So that is the only school in that particular area that had quite serious overcrowding issues. But also bear in mind, as many of you will know, that attendance was often very low in schools at this time. So the museum. Question 6 said, does your school have a museum? Seems rather a strange question for us today. The museum was usually nothing more than a display cabinet, and it would hold items used for object lessons, lumps of coal, rocks, birds' eggs, fossils, pencils. Often these would have been collected and owned by the head teacher personally. So at Ashwickham School, they had many specimens, but no space to house them. At Cley, they used the HMI's comments to plead for a cabinet. Entry in logbook by Mr. Tillard, HMI, on September the 25th, 1903. A cabinet for objects is very much wanted. You know, they're really trying to get the evidence together to say, yes, it's not just me saying we need a museum. The HMI inspector also agrees with me. At Aylsham School, they had a suitable glass-fronted cupboard, but no exhibits. Really? Because next door in the infants department, Emily Dester had quite a few objects, but no cupboard. You would have thought that a little bit of interdepartmental communication could have happened and they could have sorted that out between them. 4 types of furniture were asked about. All schools had at least 1 cupboard and a blackboard. Some of the cupboards and blackboards were inadequate. Some of the boards needed re-blacking, but otherwise I have nothing else to say about the cupboards and the blackboards. The desks. There were 2 main manufacturers of desks, Coleman and Glendenning and Hawes, and I find it really interesting that they were both based in Norwich, even though they had national acclaim. So clearly an industry to be aware of that Norwich was famed for. These 2 companies sold on a national, possibly an international scale, because they went, when the board schools were being set up in 1878, they went over to Paris to an international exhibition. That's quite something. Both schools had, both desk company manufacturers, though, took quite a dim view of boys. If we look at G.E. Hawes, who were based at Chapelfield in Norwich, of the most solid construction, he must be a wily schoolboy who manages to put any of this school furniture out of use. Each desk is for 2 boys. That was their selling point. Offers the ne plus ultra of utility and durability. And the inkstands, those troublesome affairs in a school of unruly boys, are fixed in the desk. So there we go. Coleman and Glendenning, theirs was a single desk. And that was the main difference, I think, between the two. Let's see what they say. No doubt the occupant of the seat would have to attend to his business, as the seat only affords sufficient space for a quiet lad, and would, I imagine, be an effectual cure for antics during school hours. No mention of the girls at all, obviously. Now, most desks had been provided when the board schools were established in the 1870s, when Hawes and Coleman and Glendenning were obviously very busy churning out school furniture for all these new schools being set up. So what did the head teachers think of them 30 years later in 1903? Well, this headmaster, Harry Divers at East Ruston, had plenty to say. And his main issue actually seems to be the single-use desk because it was so large. The room is narrow, the desks are big and cumbrous, no room, full of clumsy desks, but not full of children. Not sufficient room to manipulate things. If dual desks were supplied, this would allow twice as much space in front of classes as I have now. So he was clearly not happy with his furniture. This is Brinton. Coleman and Glendenning were manufacturers of school furniture in Norwich 30 years ago. The 18 desks are antique and very rickety. So he wasn't happy. And William Crary from Tilney St. Lawrence, he just drew a picture noting the defect, which I'm not quite sure what his dotted lines are trying to show, whether there was too large a gap between the seat and the desk, but clearly he wasn't happy either. And finally, the desk at Coltishall, the desk at Thwaite with Alby, he just wrote it's in a filthy condition. Well, does that mean it's faulty, or does that mean he needs a bucket of soapy water to sort it out himself? However, Charles Pearce at Hockwold, he was very happy with his desk. He done a new one 3 years ago, and he even enclosed a nice photograph from the catalogue, which had cost him £2.03, or cost the school £2.03. So he was much happier than the other heads. So what goes around comes around. So what we had in 1903, after the Balfour Act, we had all these schools coming together to form the LEAs, the board schools, British schools, national schools, church, ragged dame schools, all different types of schools coming together. And now we have the unravelling, in a way, of the LEAs with the faith schools, the federation, the free schools. We still have LEA schools, obviously, and the academy trusts. So we're tending to see a reversal just slightly more than a century later. So this is the end of my talk. But I just want to say the church, the pub and the school, we all know, are the 3 cornerstones of many a small town or village. So the history of the school is a really important piece of any jigsaw puzzle that makes up the story of your own local area. Take the story of Herbert John Lake. You would not have heard of him, not expecting you to. He was born in Erpingham in 1895. He was on the admission registers for 1903 at that school. And so he makes up one of those pupils on their survey form. Maybe he was one of those unruly boys sitting at one of those desks, I don't know. But Herbert was killed in France in the First World War, and his memorial stone is in their cemetery. So lots of other stories to find out from this survey. Thank you.